Okay, next let's move on to bone and blood. So skeletal system is obviously made of bone. So let's talk about what is bone. Well, one thing that's important to remember is that bone is living tissue, just like your lungs, just like your heart, just like your skin, just like any other tissue that you have. Bone is living tissue, just like all other tissue. It's non-static, means it's always changing, it's always reacting to the environment, it's always like moving and there's stuff happening, right? And it can react and adapt to various situations. So one example is that most important aspect of bone is that it can change its composition and physical properties as needed. But it does that, it's made up of calcified minerals, collagen fibers, and a bit of water. Mostly it's made up of calcified minerals, and it's called the protein calcium matrix. That's like the bone itself is called. The bones contain the vast majority of the calcium in our body, so it's mostly just calcified mineral. Okay. And what helps bone is that it has three important cell types: osteoclasts, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. Osteoblasts are bone forming cells. Where you can remember this is osteoblast starts with a B, so build. So osteoblasts build, they build bone. And they use calcium, so they take in calcium from the environment and they create more calcified bone material. Okay. And in opposition to osteoblasts, osteoclasts are bone deleting cells. They're involved in bone resorption, or the breakdown of these bone minerals. They yield more free calcium, and essentially it's just breaking down bone and to get more calcium in this, like the system. Okay, and osteocytes are the last ones. They're osteoblasts that get trapped in the calcified matrix that they themselves formed. They're essentially like fossilized osteoblasts. Their main function in bone is to act as like sensors for things like stress. Osteocytes are not as important, but you should know that they do exist and that they are essentially calcified osteoblasts, and they do have a function. But the main ones you should know are osteoblasts, which build, and osteoclasts, which are essentially destroy bone. And there's always a balance between these two. So they're both always active in bone. Like I said, bone's living tissue. There's always bone being made, bone being destroyed. And essentially, there's always a balance between these, and this balance shifts depending on the situation. So here, I'll move on to the next slide. Adaptability. Just like you can train your muscles with various exercises to become stronger, you can train, like, you know, if you lift a lot, your muscles will get stronger. You can also train your bones to become denser and tougher as needed. Just like with muscles, bones can get stronger and bones can get weaker if you don't use them. So if a certain bone is not strained very often, osteoclasts will make it weaker and less dense, because it feels like, well, we're not using this bone anyway. Why does it need to be this dense? We can just get more calcium, and we can save a lot of energy if we just made this like a lot weaker and less dense, this bone. So for example, if you have like, if you're like in space, or if you are like paralyzed or something like that for a couple of months or something like that, and you undergo atrophy, you'll undergo muscle atrophy, but also your bones will also start atrophying, and like the muscles and the bones in your leg will both become weaker, and your bones will be a lot easier to break in your leg, and they won't be able to support a lot of weight. And if you try and put a lot of weight onto them immediately, you'll increase the risk of like fractures and breaks. But on the opposite side, and you can train your bones if you use them a lot, use a specific bone a lot, because of some physical activity that you do, it can get tougher and stronger over time. This is why, for example, like boxers or MMA fighters, they like punch really hard things, or they kick very hard material, like sometimes trees, sometimes like the heavy punching bags or something like that. And that's because when they damage their like fists, or when they damage like their shins, which they use for kicking, the bones will kind of like start fracturing and breaking a little bit. But when they'll heal, they'll be a lot stronger. And so eventually over time, these fighters will have very, very hard fists, very hard shins for punching and kicking. Similar things for like other types of athletes. They might have like very strong bones in their legs, because they're maybe jumping from very high distances and they need to land and like not break their legs or something like that. There's a lot of examples of this. And again, this is why often when you break a bone or you fracture a bone, they say that it heals back stronger than it was before. And that's because after the bone gets broken, the osteoblasts are like, okay, well, we need to repair this to make it stronger so this doesn't happen again. So because clearly we're using this bone, or clearly this bone's in danger of breaking, so let's just make it stronger and they'll make it stronger, just like a muscle can get stronger if you train it. Okay. Another major function of bone is its blood forming function. The bone marrow is a substance found mostly in the spongy bone, but it actually can be found in all parts of bone. I'll cover this in a little bit. So bone marrow is the site of blood formation. I'm sure many of you know what bone marrow is. Some of you probably, like when you eat like a big bone, you have like that kind of like that liquid or like that kind of like fatty thing inside. So that's your bone marrow, and that's what makes the blood. Bone marrow is filled with blood stem cells, which are the progenitors of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. There are two types of bone marrow, yellow marrow and red marrow. The red marrow is one which has the hematopoietic stem cells, which are the ones used for blood formation, while the yellow one has stem cells more for cartilage and bone. During birth, an infant has nearly all red marrow in their bones, but over the aging process, more and more becomes yellow marrow, leaving red marrow only at the ends of the bone, which is a spongy bone, like I mentioned before. And you can see here. So conversion begins at the center, extends axially and peripherally over time, and you start getting more and more yellow marrow rather than red marrow. Okay. So components of blood. So blood has three cellular components: erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and thrombocytes, which are platelets. And this is a very incomplete diagram. I think I've shown the more complete diagram on the stem cell lecture. This one's very, very simple. Doesn't even have really any kind of labeling, and it's missing a few steps. But this should give you like the general idea of like blood stem cells become red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. So looking at these one at a time, first let's start with red blood cells. These are the vast majority of the blood cells, and these are what give the blood its red color. I know like a very good question to ask is like what color, not on the MCAT, but like a doctor might ask like what color is blood, and a lot of people would guess like red, right? Because red blood is red. Well, the plasma in blood is actually yellow. What makes blood red is that it has so many of these red blood cells, and it has like 200 or something million in every like drop of blood. So I've heard this example before, you took a river and then you took like a bunch of trucks with small pieces of red, like confetti, or like scraps of like paper, like construction paper, and then just dump them in the river. And you dumped so many that there's 250 million sheets of paper per little bit of river. If somebody was flying overhead in a helicopter and they saw it, they'd be like, oh, the river's bloody red, right? Because it looks all red. But then you get closer and you're like, no, it's not red. It just has little red papers inside, but it's just like a normal color. Same thing with blood. It's not red, it's yellow, but it has so many red blood cells in it that it looks red, unless you look at it like through a microscope. Okay. The major function of these red blood cells, and why we have so many, is that they carry oxygen throughout your body. Oxygen is very important, and all cells need it. Cells can't make energy. Most cells can't make energy without oxygen. You need it for ATP synthesis. And blood is something that flows throughout the whole body. So the blood carries the oxygen everywhere it goes, and as it passes by a certain tissue, a certain group of cells, some of the oxygen from the blood will go into these tissues and nearby cells and give them the oxygen so they can make their own energy. They do this via a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is found in all red blood cells, and what makes it special is that it has a variable affinity for oxygen. So this allows it to have a high affinity for oxygen when picking it up in the lungs, right? because if you need to get the oxygen onto the red blood cells onto somehow, right? Well, this hemoglobin, which is bound onto the red blood cell, it has a high affinity for oxygen in the lungs, so it will take the oxygen from the lungs and pick it up, right? Kind of like a taxi, like gets a passenger, so it picks up a passenger at the lungs, and then it carries it to where it needs to go, say the liver. And then when it gets to the liver or the target tissue, it actually has a low affinity for oxygen, a lower affinity than the actual tissue itself, which we'll talk about, which we talked about in a different lecture. And when it gets to this tissue, because it has a lower affinity, it'll actually just drop off because it doesn't want this oxygen anymore, so it'll drop it off, just like a taxi would drop it off, and it would go on its way. Okay, so it has a variable affinity. I'm sure you've seen this curve before. I'm pretty sure we've had it in a previous lecture when we talked about the pulmonary system. But essentially, this shows the affinity of oxygen, so the saturation and the concentration of oxygen, right? And this is the P50 value, right? Shows the affinity. And remember that oxygen can have a right shift or a left shift. Hemoglobin can have a right shift or a left shift, depending on the situation. So, for example, if you have a right shift, it's reduced affinity. This happens if you increase the temperature, increase the amount of this protein to 3-DPG, or you increase the acidity, right? If you make it more acidic, it also causes a right shift. You can also have a left shift, which increases the affinity by decreasing the temperature, decreasing the concentration of DPG, decreasing the acidity, decreasing the temperature, decreasing the acidity, or by adding CO, which also decreases the acidity. Okay. So like this we covered before, but just as a reiteration, this is the affinity graph, right? And this is, again, what makes it special. Okay, next up, white blood cells. So white blood cells are part of the immune system. They comprise both the innate and adaptive immune system. So natural killer cells, macrophages, B cells, T cells, that's like part of the innate immune system, and the adaptive immune system. These are what the white blood cells are. There's usually less white blood. There's a lot less white blood cells than red blood cells, unless you have like a leukemia or something, which is not normal. Much of the white blood cell function in the immune system was covered in the immune system lecture, so I won't be going too much in detail, but know that this is one of the 3 aspects of the blood, and it's a very important aspect, right? Because you need an immune system. And if you were to, for example, have too many or too little white blood cells, it could be because of a problem in your blood. Just like if you had too much or too little red blood cells, you could have a problem with your bone marrow, or it could be some other problem, right? And that's why you go to see a doctor. All right. Next up, and the third and last part of the blood, is the platelets. Platelets themselves are not cells; they are fragments of cells. So I don't think it was in this. Yeah, it wasn't in this diagram, but it was in the complete diagram. And if you want to look up, just look up blood stem cell chart or blood stem cell diagram, and you can see it. So they actually come from this one big karyocyte, and when that big cell kind of like fragments off, it makes these things called platelets, right? Which are fragments; they're not actually cells themselves. And their main function is in clotting, so stopping blood flow if you have like a damage. If they detect any damage in a blood cell, a platelet or a couple of platelets will rush to it, and then they'll release this factor, which attracts more platelets and more platelets and more platelets, and eventually all of these platelets will kind of be drawn to this hole in your blood vessel, which is bleeding, and they'll kind of like start plugging it up. When they see a hole, they become spiky, so they change actually in conformation, and they become spiky, which helps them stick to the hole and to each other a lot more, and essentially it becomes like just a big plug at the wound site, which eventually will stop the bleeding, will instantly stop the bleeding, or close to instantly will stop the bleeding, and over time will heal, and like the vessel itself will heal, regenerate, and the platelets are no longer needed. In clotting, there's also a lot of clotting factors, fibrinogen, things like that. All of these like factors, intrinsic factors, and all things like that. You don't really have to know the coagulation cascade or things like that really for the MCAT. It's really like that's very, very low yield if it will appear, and most likely if it'll appear, it'll be in a passage, so you'll be able to read about it and kind of like figure it out using the passage. There's not really much to the coagulation cascade that I think you really have to like memorize or know, other than like it uses different factors, and it's like it is a cascade essentially, that there's multiple steps and there's multiple factors like factor 8, factor 9, factor 10, all those factors. There's a lot of steps to it. Yeah. But ultimately, like for basic thing, you have to know is platelets.